Welcome to Military Analytics. In the first days of Russian leader Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, many countries, especially Western and European states, made statements criticizing Russia and supporting Ukraine. Almost the whole world declared that Putin should give up this invasion and expressed their support for Ukraine. As the war continued, these statements were replaced by concrete steps. The first concrete step towards the Russia-Ukraine war was sanctions. Western and European countries imposed over 6,000 sanctions on Russia in the first month of the war. Russia became the most sanctioned country in world history. Following the sanctions, many Western and European countries announced that they would send arms and ammunition to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army was strengthened with military aid from dozens of countries. Another important development in the war was the volunteer soldiers who joined the Ukrainian army. People from all over the world joined Ukrainian troops to put an end to Putin's tyranny and fight for Ukraine's independence. Among the volunteers who joined the Ukrainian troops were citizens from Belarus, an ally of Putin. One of them was Belarus, an Olympic athlete, Pavel Shurmay. In his statement the other day, Germany revealed a shocking truth. The details behind the Russian army's attack on his troops were revealed with this statement. How those Shurmay, a rower who twice represented Belarus at the Olympic Games, announced that he joined Ukrainian troops in the second month of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Shurmay announced his joining the Ukrainian troops with the following sentences. I am Pavel Shurmay, a well-known figure in the rowing world. I am going to Ukraine to help the brotherly Ukrainian people in the fight against the fascist Russian aggression against Ukraine. And many of us Belarusians are like that. There are many Belarusians who will fight on the Ukrainian side. If Lukashenko decides to officially involve Belarus in the war, it will come to Belarus. Glorious Ukraine! Long live Belarus! Pavel Shurmay, who joined Ukrainian troops, has been fighting the Russian invaders for over a year, made some surprising statements the other day about a curious topic. This was the Russian army attacking his own troops. This situation, which has happened many times since the beginning of the war, has raised a question mark in minds. For example, in recent weeks, a Russian warplane bombed on its own city. The details behind the Russian plane that dropped a bomb on Belgorod city center have not yet emerged. However, the recent development in Bakhmut was clarified by Pavel Shurmay's statement. In the past days, the occupying troops in Bakhmut organized an attack on their own troops. Pavel Shurmay said that he and his unit were behind this attack. The Russian troops, deceived by the Ukrainian troops, had hit the area where their own troops were located. So how did this deception take place? Let's analyze it together. As the Athenian army continued its advance against the Russian invaders, it confiscated the radios of the invaders it neutralized on the front line. These radios were used by Ukrainian troops to enable Russian soldiers to shoot their own troops. The Ukrainian unit that carried out this operation included 46-year-old former Olympic athlete Pavel Shurmay. Shurmay described the operation as follows. After we overran a trench, the commander used a radio we found, pretended to be Russian, and gave false coordinates for the Russian fire mission. And it worked. Russian troops attacked their own troops in Bakhmut, following the false coordinates they received from the radio. Unaware of anything, the invaders suffered dozens of casualties while the Ukrainian army advanced effortlessly in the war. The intelligence of armies is as important as their strength. Another Belarusian soldier who fought in the c.a.n.n.i.b.a.l.s regiment also spoke. The c.a.n.n.i.b.a.l.s regiment is a group of Belarusian opposition volunteers to defend Ukraine against Russia. One of these volunteers, Ola Deskovic, explained why Belarusians are fighting against Russia. First Ukraine, then Belarus. Russia is our common problem. Belarus is a captive of Russia and Moscow is controlling Belarus and the people. So we need to fight Russia, which will help also Belarus. That's why we are standing together. Hundreds of Belarus fighters are said to be fighting for Ukrainian independence. The exact number is not known, but it is estimated at 1,500. Shurmay and Ola, who fought in the c.a.n.n.i.b.a.l.s regiment, also said that several hundred Belarusians fought for Ukraine, so much so that the number of soldiers in the c.a.n.n.i.b.a.l.s regiment increased so much that the regiment was renamed battalion. Hundreds of Belarusian soldiers are fighting for the Ukrainian army, even though Belarus is the closest ally of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Belarus was the first country Putin visited after the start of the invasion of Ukraine. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko made statements in support of Putin after the visit, but no concrete steps were taken. Putin's goal was to include Belarus in the occupation of Ukraine and thus spread to more areas, because the Russian army was being decimated day by day with thousands of sanctions imposed in the first months of the war. Russia clearly needed help for this. The Russian leader visited China after Belarus, but he did not get the support he expected from China because Chinese President Xi Jinping said that the war should end with negotiations. Unable to get support from both allies, Putin was left alone, and Putin's loneliness is increasing day by day. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is becoming isolated in his own country. Dozens of commanders who were Putin's friends have been killed as a result of successful attacks by the Ukrainian army, so much so that the increase in losses in the war have also isolated the Russian leader because the increase in casualties has created big problems within the country. The Russian people turned against Putin and organized protests on the streets of Russia to end the war. Another example of Putin's isolation was his disagreement with Prigozhin, with whom he had been friends for years. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of the Wagner Group, and Putin have drifted apart due to the events on the front line. Putin's isolation is increasing and the Russian army is getting closer to losing against all this negativity in Russia. The Ukrainian army continues to fight successfully. The Ukrainian people support their leader, Zelensky. The army is increasing its gains on the front line, believing in victory. The Russian army is being cornered every day. Different factions within the Russian army are also contributing to Russia's failure in the war. The Wagner Group soldiers in the Russian army and the Chechen soldiers loyal to Kadyrov are causing conflicts in the army. Wagner Group soldiers do not listen to the orders of commanders in the Russian army, and Chechen soldiers are constantly humiliated because of their race and beliefs. The lack of cohesion within the army and the lack of military equipment and ammunition seem to spell the end of the Russian army. How do you assess the case of Belarusian soldiers deceiving Russian troops? Can the problems within the Russian army be resolved? Will the increasingly isolated Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, give up the invasion of Ukraine? Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko betrayed his close friend Vladimir Putin. Russian troops stationed on the border with Belarus are in a very difficult situation. While the Russian army continues to occupy Ukrainian territory for a year, Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to send troops to Ukrainian territory. Putin continues to include Russian citizens in the army with the partial mobilization decision he has taken. The Russian army's troop losses in Ukraine are close to 150,000. Russian commanders are training new recruits at the Belgorod border in order to replace the soldiers lost in Ukraine. The losses of the Russian army on the Solder and Bakhmut fronts are quite high. Ukrainian officials announced that the Russian army suffered more than 800 casualties a day only on the Bakhmut front. Considering that Russian forces have been trying to capture the city of Bakhmut for weeks, this means that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have lost their lives. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has decided to launch a major operation to expand the occupied territories in Ukraine. In this operation, Russian troops would enter Ukrainian territory through the Belarusian border and move towards the capital, Kiev. Vladimir Putin was planning to move towards Kiev with an army of 50,000 people and captured the capital, Kiev. Within a few weeks, however, the Russian leader's plans did not go as he wanted. The Ukrainian intelligence service learned that Vladimir Putin was massing troops on the border with Belarus and mobilized the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian forces deployed to the Belarusian border and formed defense lines to prevent Russian forces from crossing there. The Ukrainian army waited for days for the invading Russian forces to attack, but the Russian army did not carry out any attack. It was later learned that this military operation of Vladimir Putin was blocked by Belarus. The Russian forces deployed 50,000 Russian troops in the region on the border of Belarus and Ukraine were to enter the Ukrainian borders and move towards Kiev. However, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko did not allow the passage of Russian troops. Belarusian leader Lukashenko massed the Belarusian army on the border and blocked the Russian troops. There was a big brawl between Belarusian soldiers and Russian soldiers. Putin withdrew most of the 50,000 troops he had sent to the Belarusian border. However, some of the Russian soldiers refused to withdraw. The tension between the Russian soldiers who refused to withdraw and the Belarusian commanders escalated. Belarusian army commanders arrested a large number of Russian soldiers. Belarusian commanders created a camp here and demanded that Russian soldiers move to this camp and wait. When Russian leader Vladimir Putin learned that Belarusian soldiers did not allow Russian soldiers to pass through, he shut down all S-400 air defense systems in Belarus. Russia has the authority to remotely control the S-400 defense systems it has produced. But the Belarusian leader did not know this. Lukashenko, whose defense systems became ineffective now, had to be closer to the US and Western countries. The reason for Lukashenko's refusal to let Russian troops through is that the US and Western countries threatened Lukashenko last month in the speech made by the US and Western countries. At the United Nations meeting, Belarus's support for Russia was mentioned. Western leaders who stated that they would work to prevent this support and they should not allow the Russian army to cross the Belarusian border took action. As you know, the Belarusian government is dependent on the West and America for many things. Belarus, which is not a productive state, gets most of its food and technological equipment from the US and Western countries. Western leaders threatened to impose sanctions and embargoes on Lukashenko, threatening the collapse of the Belarusian economy. In response to these threats, Lukashenko was forced to suspend his good relations with Putin. Realizing that Russia's losing the war, Lukashenko is now trying to keep better relations with the West and the US, knowing that if Russia loses the war in Ukraine, Putin and his allies will be in a difficult situation. Lukashenko has started to listen to the US. As you know, Belarus' economy is entirely based on imports. If the US and Western countries were to impose sanctions on Belarus, the Belarusian economy would collapse, and this would put Lukashenko's throne at risk. Not wanting this to happen, Lukashenko was forced to betray Russian leader Vladimir Putin. There are countries that have supported Russia and Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Throughout history, warring states have always had an ally on their sides. It surprised everyone that Belarus, which has been allied with Russia since the beginning of the war, made such a move. Under Lukashenko's act has caused a great resonance in the Kremlin. But this was not Lukashenko's first betrayal. By the middle of the war, the occupying Russian forces had managed to advance very quickly into Ukrainian territory. Russian forces seized Ukraine's Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Kherson and Luhansk regions, capturing the most strategic parts of Ukraine. With the increasing military support of the West and the United States to Ukraine, Ukrainian forces are slowly reclaiming these occupied territories. There is a hidden truth behind the Ukrainian forces' recapture of the Lyman region, which has been under Russian occupation for the past months. Ukraine, which mobilized with a large army to the Lyman region in the Donetsk region, launched a large-scale operation in the city of Lyman. However, as a result of this operation launched by the Ukrainian army, the city of Lyman was liberated from Russian occupation. The biggest reason why Russia lost the city of Lyman was the Belarusian soldiers. Lukashenko was trying to protect the city from Ukraine by sending both his own army and mercenaries serving in Belarus to the city of Lyman. As soon as the Belarusian commanders in the area saw the Ukrainian offensive, they ordered their troops to retreat and started to leave the city. The soldiers sent by the Belarusian commanders as scouts did not report seeing the Ukrainian army and fled the area. The Belarusian soldiers who were caught unaware of the Ukrainian army's offensive quickly left the city of Lyman and left it to the Ukrainian army. The liberation of Lyman from Russian occupation may have been one of the easiest victories of the Ukrainian army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is losing a lot of power in Ukraine. He could not have predicted that the war would drag on for so long, and he could not have anticipated that the Ukrainian army would put up so much resistance. The loss of Russian forces in Ukraine is bothering Putin. On the one hand, the Russian army is trying to protect the territories it occupies, and on the other hand, it is showing a great effort on the Bakhmut front. Many of the Russian soldiers who have started to be affected by the unfavorable conditions created by the war do not want to fight in Ukraine. The majority of the Russian soldiers who do not want to fight in Ukraine are soldiers who were included in the army through partial mobilization and minority citizens living in Russia. Vladimir Putin has chosen the vast majority of the soldiers he recruited through partial mobilization from minority citizens. These minority citizens who fought for Putin in Ukraine say that Vladimir Putin does not value them and stars minority soldiers. Although not shown in the Russian media, many Russian soldiers have already laid down their arms in Ukraine. Putin, whose economy has entered a turbulent period due to the sanctions imposed on Russia by the US and the West, is having a very difficult time meeting the needs of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Russian soldiers are now defying their commanders and expressing that they do not want to fight for Putin. Likewise, many Russian commanders agree with these soldiers. If the war continues in this way, it seems that the vast majority of soldiers in the Russian army will either flee the war or surrender to the Ukrainian army. Although the Ukraine war has completed 1 year, it still continues to affect the whole world. This war, which entered the pages of history as the toughest war of the 21st century, has divided the world into two, even though it seems to be between two countries. On the one hand, Ukraine and NATO, and on the other hand, Russia and some Eastern European and Asian countries that supported in line with Russia's policies. Although Russia's war efforts have been hit hard by Western countries, economic sanctions against Russia and restrictions on countries that wanted to circumvent these sanctions, it is an undeniable fact that Russia still has great power. Russia's policies not only in Eastern Europe but also in the world's seas push the USA to take various measures. While the Russian Navy is making various moves in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the US Navy is alarmed. Let's now observe the activity of the US and Russian navies on the US coasts and in the world's seas. After World War II, powerful countries led by the USA and Soviet Russia entered the nuclear arms race. This arms race was continued not only as a nuclear power but also as a land, air and sea power. Nuclear power inherited from Soviet Russia to the present day, Russian Federation has become a major deterrent in the world's last 80 years. Despite this, the USA and other NATO countries are aware that this deterrence of Russia is just a bluff. But they still take precautions. Seeing Russian submarines off the US coast and alerting the US Navy can be the best example of this. Russia maintains its maritime presence not only in the Black Sea but also in the Baltic and Arctic seas very actively. Although it is blockaded by the NATO Navy in the Baltic Sea, it can sail to the oceans through the Arctic Ocean and the Bering Strait. Even if this opening is made with submarines, the fact that these submarines carry nuclear-tipped missiles is enough to push the Western world to take precautions. US commanders and military observers are reportedly on alert about Russian submarine fleet activities off the coast of the USA. According to officials, Russian submarines have been seen more frequently in the Mediterranean and near the US coastlines in recent weeks. This was perceived as an effort to maintain a presence in international waters, as well as Russia's preoccupation with the Ukraine war and subsequent buildup of Russian forces and nuclear submarines in the Black Sea. There are indications that nuclear-powered submarines are deployed off the coast of the US, in the Mediterranean, and elsewhere in Europe. This is why Russian deployments resemble Soviet-style submarine tactics during the Cold War. This becomes more apparent in light of the announcement made by Russian President Vladimir Putin while overseeing the commissioning of several ships, including the ballistic missile-launching Generalist Suvorov nuclear-powered submarine. Putin said his country would build more nuclear-powered submarines, ensuring Russia's security for decades to come. This is in line with the assessment that Russia continues to expand its nuclear submarine fleet. According to military experts, the exact scale of Russian nuclear submarine deployment remains unclear, but it has certainly seen a massive increase over the past 2 decades. Russia continues to increase its submarine capability and is conducting tests with the nuclear-capable Belgorod submarine capable of launching underwater unmanned vehicles. Reports last month showed that Belgorod had completed a series of tests of the Poseidon torpedo model touted as a superweapon. So what kind of measures is the USA taking against the Russian presence? An alarm was also raised by the U.S. Northern Command and the director of NORAD, the U.S. Air Force. The U.S. Northern Command also warned that Russia poses the greatest threat to the nation. They carried the Severodvinsk submarines, the first of the submarines to the Pacific. Another Severodvinsk is currently in the Mediterranean and is moving towards the Atlantic. This would be a persistent, imminent threat that could carry many ground attack cruise missiles that could threaten the United States. A few months ago, it was claimed that the forces of the Russian Navy were reinforced in the Mediterranean. This may be important given the strategic importance of the region in U.S. calculations. In addition, the USA is trying to strengthen its presence in the Mediterranean. In addition, the command of the Naval Intelligence Office underlined the risk posed by Russia's Severodvinsk-SS, or Yasin class as it is popularly known. These submarines are very, very advanced, capable of multitasking, and are becoming more and more active. There are also Russian submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic. It was stated that these submarines began to patrol the Atlantic and endangered the United States in certain areas. For this reason, it was also underlined that following these submarines in their actions would be a biplane issue for the United States. Recently, Russian officials claimed that he was apparently preparing plans to strike and neutralize Russia out of fear that the United States might lose its global dominance. To combat this potential threat, it has been suggested that Moscow could develop a new military strategy using nuclear weapons to deter potential aggression ever since Russia began fighting Ukraine. The use of nuclear weapons has become a recurring debate, and the nuclear threat has never been completely off the table. Russia continues to launch its nuclear submarines to the far seas despite a full-blown war being fought near its home. Current deployments worry the Pentagon, although military observers believed that the Ukrainian war will slow the formidable Russian Navy for several years. So what steps is Russia taking to further increase its naval power? The Russian Navy has the most diverse submarine fleets in the world. Moscow says that as an important component of its strategic deterrence, some of these submarines are capable of launching ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country has worked relentlessly to upgrade its submarine forces, especially in recent years. Moscow has developed a large number of submarines that can achieve the most strategic targets in the USA and continental Europe. Russia is one of the few most powerful states in the world, especially as a naval power, and we can see this clearly in the Ukraine war. Although Russia's attacks from the Black Sea Fleet have decreased now due to the shortage of ammunition and the loss of ships due to the attacks of the Ukrainian army, the attacks of the Russian Black Sea Fleet at the beginning of the war were quite difficult for the Ukrainian army, with an estimated 58 ships. The Russian Navy manages one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. However, these ships can be deployed worldwide, causing U.S. commanders to be alarmed and the Russian Navy challenging the influence of the U.S. Navy. Russian President Vladimir Putin oversaw the commissioning of several new warships and a nuclear-powered submarine while promising to further strengthen the Russian Navy. This outburst of Putin also found wide coverage in the Russian media. Putin, who has largely avoided public relations since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, gave the green light to the hoisting of Russian flags on new ships via video link. The newly commissioned ships included a corvette, a minesweeper, and the nuclear-powered Generalissimus Suvorov submarine capable of launching ballistic missiles. Another nuclear submarine, Emperor Alexander II, launched last week and will enter service after trials. We will increase the speed and volume of construction of various ships. We will equip them with the most modern weapons, the Russian leader said in his statements through the media. These steps of Putin are taken to reliably ensure the security of Russia and the protection of its national interests in the world's oceans. During his 2 decades in power, Putin has made strengthening its armed forces a top priority by equipping the Navy with new warships and adding hypersonic missiles, which Putin describes as invincible to Russia's arsenal. But Russia has faced a series of failures on the battlefield in Ukraine, which has proven to be a formidable competitor, largely thanks to the shipment of modern weapons it has received from the West to resist in its war with Russia. Russia's active appearance in the games and the fact that it has lost superiority in the Ukraine war, on the other hand, confronts us as a great dilemma, considering the fact that the Russian Navy is equipped with nuclear warheads. It is an undeniable fact that it is a great deterrent, but it should not be forgotten that the NATO Navy also has nuclear power and has more elements than the Russian Navy. As the Ukraine war evolves into a second Cold War between Russia and NATO, we will see together how the two sides will move and how the war will be shaped according to these moves.